and essentially you identified 3 options to improve revenue, which is set out at about point 7 on the page, 3950.
Yes.
Getting full approval for poker machines in the casino was one option.
Yes.
Another option was approval for poker machines so that they could be played just by international or interstate patrons.
Yes.
And the third option was amendments to be made to the criteria in the gaming machine national standard.
Yes.
And it was that third option that was the one that was pursued, not the first 2 internally by Crown. Is that right?
Yes.
And the purpose of pursuing that option, the amendments to the WA appendix, was to improve revenue.
Yes, noting the context I provided previously.
And therefore, the inherent premise on which you were proceeding was that these amendments that were being proposed would improve revenue because they would encourage people to play longer on the machines or spend more on the machines. Is that right? Or both?
I think that was the advice being received from the gaming team. And again, it was around declining revenue. It was around job losses. So absolutely, Crown wanted to ensure the business continued to be viable, competing against online casinos, wagering, Airbnb. These were all challenges at that particular time, together with a soft market. So yes, that was absolutely the intention.
So CRW.705.001.0255. This is a placeholder for a meeting to be held on the 14th of February 2019 in relation to this subject matter, do you see?
Yes.
At Crown Perth.
Yes.
Between you and Mr. Hume and Mr. Connolly.
Yes.
The 3 fishing friends. Did it occur to you at the time that it was inappropriate for you and Mr. Hume to participate in this meeting, given your relationship with Mr. Connolly?
No, not at all. We were entirely professional and conducted ourselves professionally throughout the entire meeting. The discussion was to talk about relevant considerations to a proposal, which was not uncommon for Crown to do in terms of its engagement with the department.
Now, after this meeting with Mr. Connolly, there was a submission that was sent to GWC by Crown Perth, wasn't there?
Yes.
And if we pull up the letter from Mr. Felsted to Mr. Ord, dated the 7th of March 2019, CRW.709.132.6302, were you involved in the preparation of this letter?
Yes, I was.
Did you think that was appropriate given your relationship with Mr. Connolly?
I did, given the letter itself talks to all relevant considerations. It's professional, it's transparent. So yes, entirely.
And but you understood that Mr. Connolly would be likely to review this letter and make a recommendation to the GWC in respect of its contents?
I understood Mr. Connolly would receive the letter, consider relevant consideration, and the Gaming Wagering Commission would make its decision on the merits of the application. Yes.
CRW.709.075.3660. This is your email to Mr. Felsted, Mr. Preston and Mr. Bossy, dated 17 April 2019, referencing that you and Mr. Hume and Mr. Sullivan had met with Mr. Connolly that afternoon to discuss a submission relating to the amendments to the WA appendix. See that?
Yes.
This was ahead of the GWC monthly meeting that was to occur on the 30th of April 2019, at which the submission of 7 March would be considered.
Yes.
Again, did it occur to you that it was inappropriate for you and Mr. Hume to be approaching Mr. Connolly yourselves, in relation to that submission, given your personal relationship?
No. The email confirms the matters discussed were all relevant considerations. They related to the proposal. There's no information that's passed that was considered to be inappropriate or not relating to the submission.
Now, in this email, you set out the current position, and if I can take you to the second dot point, Mr. Connolly is separately preparing a paper for the Commission outlining the department's position, including its recommendation. Do you see that?
Yes.
Did you consider that your personal relationship with Mr. Connolly might assist him in forming a favourable recommendation?
Not at all. Mr. Connolly is entirely professional. Those submissions are all relevant considerations. The Gaming Wagering Commission ultimately determines the application, so at no stage did that ever enter my mind.
So just if you look past that third dot point at the paragraph or the sentence that begins, "At this stage, Mick has requested the following additional information."
Yes.
That's the Mick that you referred to a moment ago, that when you're at work you refer to him as Mr. Connolly with the utmost respect.
Yes.
Or you're referring to him as Mick here.
Yes.
Well, that's how you address him in your social relationship.
I think everyone addressed him as Mick. I was probably the only one who addressed him as Mr. Connolly in most of my correspondence, and I can confirm only 6 months ago I spoke to someone on my team and said, make sure you make it Mr. Connolly.
Now, if we come back to this paragraph, so Mick has requested the following additional information, and would you agree that the 3 dot points that follow, identifying the information that he has requested, involves matters that would all support a favourable recommendation or a recommendation in favour of Crown's submission?
If the information is provided and can be provided, I think also all those points cover public interest. The Gaming Wagering Commission is assessing not just submissions in isolation, it needs to take into consideration all these matters about growth, tourism, employment, what Crown contributes. Mr. Connolly makes a specific point that he doesn't feel that the Commission is aware of those matters. So I believe it's entirely appropriate, and it happens in a lot of contexts, whether it's planning or environment, that there is this level of engagement to understand applications to ensure that it's a fulsome submission and it contains relevant considerations. Otherwise, the GWC is not being informed of the whole picture. And in doing so, if it only gets half the picture, and there are consequences for that, for example, Crown has to sack 500,000 people, I'm pretty sure they'll be asking, why wasn't this information told to us? So I see it as relevant, I see it as balanced and fair.
So let's have a look at that balance and fairness.
Yes.
On the screen you look at the second last paragraph commencing overall based on his commentary. Mick appears to remain receptive to the proposal.
Yes.
Now, you go on to say, and is likely to recommend the Commission approve the proposal. He is requiring the above information to better inform the Commission and the Minister that the benefits from the proposal far outweigh any political, RSG or other concerns. You see that?
Yes.
Surely it must have occurred to you when you were writing this email that because of your personal relationship, there was an available perception, if not an actual possibility, that Mr. Connolly was favouring the recommendation and supporting it because of his personal relationship with you and Mr. Hume.
No, not at all. Never once entered my mind, and I think the information that Mr. Connolly was seeking was entirely appropriate and related to relevant considerations to the application. Again, to realise that suppliers might be at risk. I recall as part of the cost cutting, we were looking at winding back donations to charities. We were looking at winding back community partnerships. These are all relevant considerations when taking into account any submission, and that never once crossed my mind that Mr. Connolly, because of the relationship, in fact it's quite the opposite. It's actually putting all relevant information in front of the Gaming Wagering Commission.
Now you recall, don't you, that the GWC didn't end up considering this submission and deciding upon it. Sorry, I withdraw that, that's not quite right. It considered the submission from time to time in subsequent meetings, but did not actually make a decision on the submission until July 2019. Do you recall that?
Not specifically, but yes.
Shortly prior to that July meeting, you emailed Mr. Connolly on the 18th of July 2019, that's DLG.8001.0003.3735. And we'll need to go to the attachments. I'm just informing the operator. So you sent Mr. Connolly on the 16th of July 2019, just before the GWC meeting, a little while before it, a series of documents attached to this email for his consideration, didn't you?
Yes.
And the first was a draft paper. It's the first attachment, WA Appendix is the title. You prepared a draft paper for Mr. Connolly to put before the GWC as his own document?
I'm not...
Let's open that up if we can. I had it in native format. Just got to open it up in native. The operator might just take a moment to pull it up. Mr. Murray. Commissioners, we might need to just pause for a moment, I think, because there's an issue with the operator being able to pull up the attachments, which I need to take the witness to.
You're not suggesting we adjourn, just
Well,
take a pause?
I'll just check to see how long they think it will take them to pull it up. What I might do is start another topic if the commissioners are happy for me to do so.
Yes, thank you.
I want to ask you about the Riverbank matter, Mr. Murray. From about paragraph 68, that's page 0036 of your witness statement, you begin to give some evidence about the Riverbank accounts. And in very broad terms, the effect of your evidence, as I understand it, is that you knew nothing about those accounts and had no involvement with them until the Bergen inquiry. Is that right?
Yes.
But you commenced an internal review at your own instigation after hearing Mr. Preston's evidence in respect of Riverbank during the Bergen inquiry in around September 2020.
Yes.
Did you seek or obtain any authority from anyone to commence that internal review?
No, not at all. I was watching the Bergen inquiry and I saw Mr. Preston being questioned, and it was painful watching and came as an absolute shock, and I just knew I had to do something. So I decided to speak to Denise van der Klauw, who was in the compliance team, and said, can you please help me?
The Crown Group was confronting allegations on several other fronts at this stage, though, wasn't it? Criminal associations of junkets brought to Crown Melbourne and Crown Perth, the China arrests.
Yes.
What was it about the Riverbank account specifically that caused you to take it upon yourself to conduct an internal review?
I was just so shocked and surprised that this could be happening within our bank accounts. And I recall Bergen Inquiry going to each transaction one by one, and that was something that just particularly seeing Mr. Preston in the witness box was difficult, and just turned my attention to that.
Now, if we go to crw.547.002.1347, this is the memo that you wrote to Mr. Barton, the Chief Executive Officer, dated 29 September 2020, which is basically the effect of your investigation to that date. You and others across Melbourne and Perth had undertaken, but at your instigation.
Yes, I had commenced almost immediately on seeing Mr. Preston's evidence. Short time thereafter, I think it was once Mr. Preston was out of giving evidence and he was arranging meetings, I informed him we'd already started a review, and I was looking at the aggregated practices, and as a result of that, there was a request to broaden it to include Crown Melbourne. So there was a team in Crown Melbourne that then facilitated that review, and we continued in terms of the team looking at the Perth Riverbank statements.
Now, I want to clarify something at paragraph 69, little a of your witness statement at page 0036. We could pop that out, please. The second sentence, purpose of the internal review was not to identify any potential money laundering, but related specifically to the practice of aggregation.
Yes.
However, the reason that you were interested in aggregation, the practice of aggregation, was because it was an indicator of possible structuring to avoid detection of transactions that could be money laundering. Isn't that right?
Absolutely, that formed the basis to it. But as to whether or not ultimately those transactions, one, were to be identified, and then what they actually meant, required, and I think the memo says it needs to be externally reviewed, because I know expertise in money laundering, and since then there was the report by Initialism, which went at great length explaining all sorts of terms that I had no understanding of whatsoever. So it certainly was centred around aggregated practices and what's actually going on there.
Come back to your memo dated 29 September 2020. Look at numbered paragraph 3. I'll read out the number again, crw.547.002.1347. And you and others involved in this investigation had identified a total of 102 instances where there were aggregation concerns. Is that right?
Yes.
And that meant that in your mind they were suspicious transactions?
Not necessarily. That's why it needed to, one, be forensically critiqued. We were doing this on the run with someone in office literally going through the bank statements. We didn't understand what half the narrations meant in terms of the bank's language. We didn't...
They were suspicious, weren't they, in the sense that they required further investigation?
They were suspicious.
Well, in fairness, Ms. Cale, suspicious has a particular meaning in...
Possibly, but I think that further investigation needed to be done to confirm it, because part of what needed to be actually determined was were the patrons actually gambling, were there's justifications for it. It was to just to confirm what was happening in those accounts.
But isn't the short point this, Mr. Murray, that the 102 instances that you had identified were transactions which might be structuring or might not be structuring? They might be completely normal transactions, or they might be structuring, and there needed to be an investigation to ascertain which was which.
My level of AML knowledge was not sufficient to know what structuring was at the time. Yes, it had been discussed in the Bergen inquiry, but the purpose of the exercise was to pinpoint what was happening within the cage and how and why these, was it happening for starters, and if it was, what's the extent of it, to then hand it to an external forensic expert and also to initialism in terms of actually providing. But
Right.
yes,
So you were identifying the transactions that needed to be sent off to somebody else to investigate further to see whether there was some issue about them from an AML perspective.
whether or not the suspicion could be formed, yes.
Now, at page 1349, at 1349, numbered paragraph 8, you say, in other words, this issue of aggregation affected a small proportion of the value of funds credited to the Riverbank and South Bank accounts, 0.3%. Were you trying to reassure Mr. Barton at that point that this issue about aggregation wasn't really a cause for too much concern?
My recollection was that there are a number of iterations of this memo. It was sent through Minter Ellison at the time. It came back with amendments. Those amendments, one of them, I believe, was this amendment, and I didn't appreciate the reason for the memo, but I was being asked to provide confirmation around that information and in terms of the review. So on receiving those iterations, I confirmed that statement was correct and the memo remains correct.
If we go back to numbered paragraph 7 on the previous page, you split out the Riverbank and South Bank accounts. The Riverbank account is at sub-paragraph A, and the instances of aggregated deposits there are 15.74% of the total number of credits and 1.6% of the total value of credits for the full period. And if we go over the page for the corresponding percentages for the South Bank account, they're much smaller. You see that?
Yes.
And what you've done is basically averaged them in numbered paragraph 8, haven't you?
That, I think, was what occurred, yes.
Yeah. But what numbered paragraph 7 actually showed was that there was
15.
much greater cause for concern in relation to the Riverbank account from your investigations than the South Bank account.
Yes, and that's identified in the memo.
Now, if we go to this document, CRW.709.136.4782, this is an email from you to Mr. Connolly dated the 26th of October 2020. You forwarded a presentation to Mr. Connolly ahead of a meeting with the GWC the following day. You recall this?
Yes.
And you had prepared the presentation.
With input from others within the group, yes.
You had prepared the presentation.
Yes.
Thank you. What was the reason for providing Mr. Connolly with an advance copy?
I think so it could be provided to the Gaming Wagering Commission.
If we go to CRW.709.136.4783, did you review this document overnight, Mr. Murray?
Yes.
It doesn't make any mention of your internal review or the results of it to that date, does it?
No. The review was made public through the Bergen inquiry, and at the same time it was then subsequently being forensically assessed, reviewed by Grant Thornton and initialism, so it was preliminary. It was an internal review. When I commenced the original review, it was almost as just trying to get a very scratched sense of what's going on, and just morphed into something much bigger once the initialism took over. So can only suggest that's the reason why it wasn't included. It was still a work in progress.
Well, you could have included that work in progress in the presentation, couldn't you? And said that it was subject to external review.
Absolutely.
And so the reason why you didn't provide the preliminary results?
Well, because they were preliminary, did not cross our mind at the time. We were taking advices from Initialism, Minter Ellison, discussing with ILGA, Austrac. There are a number of things happening at that time, and if it was an omission, it certainly wasn't a deliberate one.
Well, you then participated in the verbal presentation to GWC the following day, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And Mr. Barton and Mr. Bossy were there?
Yes, Mr. Barton was by phone, I believe, by video conference.
And none of you made mention of this internal review and the results of it to that date?
Don't believe so, no.
And if we go back to the presentation at page 4795, at the conclusion, second dot point, Crown tells GWC, as the Commission is aware, Crown has a long-standing open and transparent engagement with the Commission. Well, it wasn't being as open and transparent as it could have been on this occasion, was it, by not referring to the internal review and what it had uncovered to that date?
I'm, in part, the understanding the purpose of the meeting, and I think from memory it was about the reform agenda, and it was about the immediate controls that we were putting in place to proactively, through, and notwithstanding the Bergen inquiry had not completed, and we were being still at the same time respectful to any findings of the Bergen inquiry, we were committed to proactively taking steps to amend the the casino manual, operations manual. So there were a lot of things going on. I don't think that it can necessarily be characterised as us not being open and transparent. There was just so much going on, and was it the purpose of the meeting to discuss a preliminary review? I don't know if that was the main purpose.
It was terribly important for the regulator to know that you had concerns about the operation of the Riverbank account. Would you agree?
Absolutely, and I think if you go through the presentation, we address that specifically in the presentation. At the same time, these matters were being aired through publicly in the Bergen inquiry. They were through media in terms of the review. My name got mentioned time and time again in terms of that memo and the work that was being done in terms of that memo. So,
Mr. Moraine?
Yes.
The GWC could not be expected to follow the Bergen inquiry as a primary source of information about how its licensee is conducting itself. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
It ought to get that information from its licensee first and foremost, oughtn't it?
Yes, it's important.
And that's why the Crown Perth had a responsibility to provide all information of relevance to the regulator as soon as it became available.
Yes, and complete.
And the results of your investigation to that date should have been disclosed to the GWC on the 27th of October, shouldn't it?
I think the Commission would have been aided by it, yes.
You should have disclosed it. Now, you explain at 69 little m of your witness statement at page 38 and the following paragraphs that after your internal review, as I think you've alluded to in some of your answers to my questions, this then led to an external review in which you were involved, the external review being undertaken by Grant Thornton and Initialism.
Yes.
And it's 16 November 2020, Crown and you specifically received the final Grant Thornton and Initialism reports in respect of Riverbank and Southbank.
No, I think Southbank came on the 17th of November.
all right? And you were aware by looking through the initialism report when you received it that the report identified indicators of money laundering at Perth Casino through the Riverbank account.
Yes.
And Mr. Barton, the CEO, sent a letter to GWC on the 14th of December 2020. That's gwc.0004.0015.0001. And you tell us at paragraph 69S at page 39 of your witness statement that you assisted in the preparation of this letter.
Yes.
Did you draft it?
Yes.
Why did it take almost a month to inform GWC of the external reports and their important contents?
Simultaneous to preparing this letter, and the original intention was to provide it more promptly to the GWC. At the time, there were competing demands with AUSTRAC notifications. There was the ILGA inquiry. There was also what took over initially was the drafting of a similar letter to the Victorian Gaming Commission. There were multiple persons providing input into drafting of each and every letter. By the time it got to around end of November, I still had queries from Neil Jeans from Initialism, and I've got an email confirming that I needed to confirm with Mr. Jeans issues, matters relating to money remitters and junkets that are referred to in his report, because the controls that we were putting in place needed to adequately address what he had identified, and I wanted to confirm that first with Mr. Jeans. So a combination of all those matters. There was only myself driving these correspondence and then engaging with multiple people from the Crown Group, from Mr. Barton, Mary Manos, the General Counsel. There was the Executive Group Manager Compliance. There was the Investor Relations. So there were a lot of people, and it just was conflicting. So it was not a question of deliberately being tardy or wanting to delay providing this to the Gaming Wagering Commission. It's just that's how it ended up taking that time.
There was nothing to stop you providing those reports earlier to GWC, was there?
There was, in terms of seeking clarification from Mr. Jeans as to matters relating to money remitters and making sure that the controls that we were proposing in the casino manual, the operations manual, adequately addressed what he had identified.
There was nothing to stop you providing the reports and explaining to GWC that you were seeking clarification about certain matters.
Looking back, you're right, but the purpose of the letter was actually to talk to the controls that we had put in place. So it seemed as though that was more important to me, at least, making sure that we were addressing those issues proactively. I think it was prior to, in November, there were, or it might even be part of this letter, sorry, it's just been such a blur, we updated and proposed changes to the casino manual, which we provided to the Gaming Wagering Commission just to proactively show that we were addressing the issues. So, yes, we could have done it.
Well, Mr. Murray, what the initialism report indicated was the possibility of historical money laundering through the Riverbank accounts. You'd accept that?
Yes.
And what you're talking about as the reason why you couldn't provide those reports to GWC, Initialism and Grant Thornton, was because you were formulating responses to that finding, how Crown would react. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So there was nothing to stop you from informing GWC before the 14th of December of the important fact it should know of historical indications of historical money laundering through the Riverbank accounts. You'd agree with that?
Yes, I agree with that, but I even recall the email saying we can either send it separately or put it as part of the letter, the broader letter, which wrapped it all together rather than piecemeal. And I can produce that email to the Commission if it assists. The email went to the General Manager of Regulatory and Corporate Projects, where I indicated that we can either send it as a separate letter or send it together as part of this letter. I want to clarify things with Neil Jeans first before. So the decision was made then. We don't have luxury to obviously go back in time, and maybe I should have taken that path, but I didn't at the time, and if that's an error, then I accept that criticism.
Well, this initialism report and the Grant Thornton reports weren't in fact provided to the GWC on the 14th of December until late afternoon. Recall that? 5:15 p.m.
Yes.
With a GWC meeting to be held the next day.
Yes.
And you assume the next morning.
Yes.
And you didn't attend Crown's presentation at that meeting, did you?
No, I didn't.
But you were aware that Crown was attending the meeting.
Yes.
To present to GWC about these matters.
About the reform program, I think it was an opportunity to introduce the chair of Crown Resorts to the Gaming Wagering Commission. I distinctly recall either the next day or the following day, or may have been at the operations meeting, criticism from Mr. Connolly. Why was this full pack of 200 pages provided the day before? And I said to Mr. Connolly, that was not the intention. There's no way we would expect the Commission to have reviewed any of those materials. It was, again, this issue of joining the two letters together, and it was definitely not intended that that subject was even to be covered as given the length of the document itself. It was intended to be provided for further discussion, and a subsequent meeting was always what I had intended and expected would happen. I would even expect the GWC to have possibly got its own expert to have then reviewed it and provided its opinion on it. It wasn't intended for that meeting at all.
Well, Mr. Murray, did Crown want to avoid GWC having too much time before Crown's presentation on the 15th of December to consider the contents of the initialism report and its response to that report without Crown having first presented?
No, not at all. In fact, my expectation was that it may have taken months, if not longer, for the GWC to have appreciated what was conveyed in that report. There were a lot of foreign concepts, at least from my mind, and what was actually going on. And I would have thought as I said, the GWC may have engaged its own consultant to provide it advices, but it was definitely not to catch them out or shock them or anything of that nature at all.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. Commissioner, may I please have a short adjournment just to get those emails uploaded for that last short series of questions?
All right, we'll adjourn for a short time. Let us know when
Thank you.
you're ready to resume.
Rise.